Hi everyone, this is Robert and welcome to IDG Live. Today we have part of a sort of an ongoing series that I've just been starting, interviewing interesting people who have uh, perspectives on these worlds that we are looking at. A Song of Ice and Fire, Lord of the Rings, and I'm delighted today that my special guest is Jason Kingsley. Here he is, the Modern Knight. Welcome, thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure. It's been a frosty morning, so it was an early start. I had all my horses to feed and water, so I'm quite relieved to be in out of the cold. Actually, it's surprisingly chilly out there right now.
Yes, I can imagine. I mean, it's just before we came on air, you pulled a little bit of hay from what looked like your ear, which that's
Well,
proof
it
of
was
going out
actually
with the horses.
it was caught in my hair because you're flinging hay around. It's slightly breezy. You fling the hay over a stable door to a horse. They eat about a third of a bale of hay for those that are interested in the cold a day. So you've got to keep them fed. You've got to keep the water. You've got to break the ice on the top of the water bucket. They can do it themselves, but if it gets too thick, they can't. And just check they're okay. And so, of course, it flies in your face, and then you come in and you forget that you've got hay stuck in your hair, and you're about to come online and talk to people and try to be all sophisticated.
Well, you're looking dapper and sophisticated. Do not worry about that at all. So, first of all, for those who do not know, Modern History TV, you've got a YouTube channel. You are the Modern Knight. What is the other than obviously having horses? What is the Modern Knight? What do you do?
I've been fascinated by knights in armor and horses, castles and things like that my whole life, including the sort of more fantasy elements. So including kind of pop culture phenomena like The Witcher. Like, I mean, arguably is Lord of the Rings pop culture? I think it probably is in part, but also not as literature. I first read Lord of the Rings when I was 8 years old, and I remember picking the book up as one of my first ever big adult books, and I didn't realize quite how big it was at the time, but I managed to wade my way through it in the way that an 8-year-old might. Probably missed out lots of bits and didn't understand the vast majority of it, but the idea of an adventure, the idea of traveling, the idea of going into a different world really appealed to me, and I've managed to keep that side of my life going in spite of formal education. I went to Oxford, did a zoology degree. I'm the CEO of a big company called Rebellion. We make computer games and publish comics and books and all that kind of stuff. But I've always kept my fascination with other dimensions, if you like, the worlds that we explore in our minds. And in my case, I'm lucky in that I've sort of converted that into reality. So I breed and train real war horses. They're stallions. They're Iberian types of horses mostly. I train them for use with armor and lances. I actually joust. I've actually fought in real tournaments. I have never actually tried to kill somebody, but I've had various people get very upset in tournaments with me. And quite frankly, it was fairly frightening, but the armor protects you. That's what armor does. So I wanted to have all those experiences myself a little bit, as well as reading about them. So yeah, so I straddle this sort of pretend and real component of the sort of medieval.
Excellent. And then you share that through the videos, as I say, Modern History TV. I'll put a link down in the description for people. I do highly recommend it. But let's dig into one of the reasons I wanted you on here is this kind of reality of fantasy worlds idea, because I'm a big believer that for a fantasy world to work, it has to feel real in some way. It has to. You have to think that everything operates in a way that you could imagine that yes, there might be magic or whatever, but this is actually works. So you mentioned Lord of the Rings. How? I mean, it sounds like a terrible question. How good a job do you think Tolkien did here in terms of sort of the realism of this world? Let's take, because I know you're very much a horse person. Let's take Rohan. There's a big Rohan film coming out soon, actually, animated film, The War of the Rohirrim. How does that, as a culture, a horsey culture, how does that work? Does that feel right to you?
Yes, I mean they missed out. I am not going to start even vaguely criticising the professor. His work is absolutely awesome. However, there are details. I'm on Modern History TV, which is a weird name for a medieval YouTube channel, I know, and there's a reason it was misnamed and it wasn't expect it to be particularly popular, but it's kind of grown and now it's stuck. But what I try to do in particular is research ordinary people's lives and find out. We read about kings, but usually kings have got people, specifically writing about their lives. So they're doing it in a very knowing way. Whereas ordinary people taking other neighbours to court over flooding cesspits or escaped pigs is real and isn't written with a view. It's recorded in court rolls from the medieval period, and it's not recorded for any reason other than it needs to be written down at the time. And we can look at these snapshots of people's lives. So what I find really interesting about Lord of the Rings is the way it starts small and then expands. You start in this pastoral, lovely landscape. Hobbits eat a lot, so presumably they have so one of the things I would look at is hobbits have a very strong appetite, which means they must have a very efficient agricultural system. So they've got to be, and they didn't really mention anything in the way of farming technology. So one wonders how they farmed. What kind of creatures would hobbits use to plough their fields? They mentioned Farmer Maggot, and there's mushrooms in his fields, and there's carrots, and in the movie there's maize, but I think in the book it's more likely to be corn or barley, which was barley and rye were very popular in the medieval England. So Tolkien was probably talking about that. But back in the day, heritage corn grows quite tall, and that grows taller than the height of a hobbit. So arguably maize and hobbit actors maybe work okay. Maybe the corn for a hobbit was head height. Anyway, so you can see how I start to think about, so what is the distribution structure? Where are the manufacturing, who's manufacturing all these tea cakes? And they talk about tea. So tea is imported unless it grows. And of course they grow tobacco. They grow long bottom leaf, don't they, in the Shire, and that's exported. So there's an export and presumably an import market. And I start to think, right, so what are the systems that the hobbits have to keep the Shire fed? Because if you're eating a lot, you need a lot of infrastructure around you. And so Tolkien misses out on that, because arguably those are the sort of prosaic background details. So whenever I read about kings and courtiers and grand people in history, I'm always wondering about the people that ran the kitchens, or that cleaned the toilets, or that swept up, or that dusted. Let's face it, you're going to have to, somebody dusted the throne of England and still does. And what's their life like? They're just sitting there going, bloody king, there's dust everywhere again, God blimey. Or somebody comes in running saying, oh my God, we haven't dusted for a week and the king's coming in an hour. Can you quickly clean the throne? So all of these sort of little tiny background factors. I once ran a role-playing game, a long time ago, very, very low level characters of actual street urchins. The type of street urchin that Sherlock Holmes had is part of his sort of eyes on the ground in the infrastructure. And for them, a dagger was a great treasure, because everything scales. They all had one hit point. And rats were incredibly dangerous. They weren't just low-level monsters; they were incredibly dangerous monsters, and adults were scary. And it was really interesting because it lowered the level. And one of the issues I sometimes have with adventure stories is necessarily the great and the good that get talked about, and all of the other people don't so much. And I'm fascinated by that.
No, and that's something that I talk about even more actually over on A Song of Ice and Fire, because that's told from I don't know how into it you are Game of Thrones, but the way the books are structured is it's from POVs from different characters, and they're all from what we would today probably call the 1%, and so we miss out on the vast swathe of the people of Westeros, the small folk, George R. R. Martin calls them, or that's what his POV characters call them. But yeah, I absolutely 100% agree that.
Let's talk about ordinary people, ordinary lives, and the lives behind the throne, literally, or in the kitchens of the great castle. And that's been my fascination with my research. You get a sort of an honest opinion about it. I was the last video I've done, which for some YouTube is interesting, because sometimes you do a video you're really pleased with and it doesn't get much traction, and other times you do a video you're also pleased with and suddenly it goes ballistic. And I've just done one that's gone ballistic nearly 400,000 views in 48 hours, which is just amazing.
Mm.
And I was talking about where poor people stayed when they're traveling. And so one of the things that always occurs to me is books. So in Tolkien's work, they go on long journeys and they're sleeping on the ground. And if you've ever slept on the ground, it's really, really uncomfortable.
Yes.
You do everything you can. You pile leaves up, and I've done a few. And you wake up and you think, I need a bed, and that's one night. And they were out for months, literally. And so hobbits must be incredibly hardy, or maybe their slight more chunkiness means they can sleep on the ground a bit better. I don't know.
Well, maybe yes. So, I mean, just at the risk of spoiling that video. So, what is what is the headline answer? Go and watch the video, everyone. But what is the headline answer? Could the poor people afford an inn for the night, or was it sleeping
Basically,
bushes?
if you were if you were a merchant traveling on business, or you were more middle class or above, sort of slightly wealthier than poor, or had some spare money, you'd stay in an inn. And that was
Mm.
what you'd stay. And they had various different qualities of inn and different qualities of accommodation. If you were poor, you stayed in a religious institution. You stayed in a monastery. And before the
Mm.
reformation of the monasteries, there were strong networks of big and small monasteries. They would give you a bed for the night. It wouldn't be a bed. It'd probably be a bench, but it was indoors and out of the wind. And they would feed you. And again, it wouldn't be posh food unless you were the king. It would
Yeah.
be sufficient food, I think, to use in the rules. So it would be plain food. It might just be oatmeal and some vegetables or something, but it would be more than sufficient to keep you going. And then they were supposed to look after you. You weren't supposed to talk much, and then you went to bed at dusk, and you weren't supposed to be
Mm.
disruptive. But it was free. It was literally free accommodation. So you had this
Okay.
network of travel stations, if you like. They had a monastery, and there was a bit sometimes outside, sometimes just on the inside, where you turned up and they went, welcome, you can sleep here then in the night and then go on your journey. And I just think that's something that we miss. That would be lovely to hear about in a fantasy novel, for example.
Absolutely would. I mean, I think the difference, I guess, is a lot of fantasy worlds, they have different religions and things like that. So the social structures may not be there, and all that's left is the thing that we understand is the inn or whatever. But no, that's absolutely fascinating. Can I just briefly bring you back to
Yeah.
one of my pet hobbies is the economy. I have a time I've done various videos on what Aragon's tax policy is and things like that. But the economy of the Shire, you touched on it a bit ago about the lack of heavy industry. The way that Tolkien describes this was that the hobbits, he says in the intro to Lord of the Rings, a well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favourite haunt. They did not understand or like machines more complicated than a forge bellows, a watermill, or a hand loom, though they were skillful with tools. Now, I happen to have recently been to visit a watermill, Sarehole Mill. If you've never been, by the way, this is Tolkien's childhood haunt. This is the inspiration, the original inspiration for the Shire. And there's a watermill there, just like in all of our imaginations of the Shire. And I have to say, I thought a watermill looked quite complex. Is the way Tolkien describes it as if this is quite simple, which I guess on a basic level it is. It's just the water comes and pushes the big wheel, and then that turns and can grind the corn. The principle is simple, but in terms of the size and scale of one of these things, it's actually quite an achievement when you look at it. These kinds of things. So, do you think that just thinking about the economy, as we were a moment ago, of the Shire, do you think that it is possible with just a handful of like mills or something like that, some clever usage of tools, that you would be able to feed the Shire, or do you think that actually they do need extra stuff in from outside?
I think you'll probably be able to feed it on a simple diet. It also depends on the soil. It depends on the climate, obviously, as you know. I mean, if it's more barren, there's not much grows in other parts of Middle-earth. But in the Shire, I think the implication is it's a very fertile and gentle landscape, very much like southern England, I suppose. So It's never really very cold. It's never really very hot. It's always greenish, even at the height of summer. Maybe it gets a little brown in the height of summer, but basically it's still green. And therefore you can create a lot of food for your hobbits, but you're going to need to. I mean, their whole society is about multiple meals. So,
Yes.
On the other hand, they have no tradition of shoes. So there's a big chunk of their society that don't have hobbit cobblers. There's nobody making shoes.
Do not. Although they do have a big thing about buttons and brass buttons. Is that a? I mean, I don't know. Exposing the limitations of my own knowledge here quite clearly, but is it possible to make that kind of like shiny, beautiful bit of ornamentation without the heavy industry? Is it just a handcrafted thing at that point? Is it just
handcrafted, hand polished? But they clearly had water power, so you're going to have hand powered polishing machines. You just polishing something, but you're also going to have water power as well. So back in the Middle Ages, they had water wheels that did hammering for hammering out plates for plate armor. 13th, 12th, 13th century. Well, the Romans, the ancients had water mills and things like that. So goes back millennia. So you've got the power to substitute for the elbow grease. So absolutely, and polishing is really just a matter of polishing brass or armor. Steel is just a matter of slowly going down the grit until you get to fine dust. Jeweler's rouge is a very, very fine powder, super fine, so that you get that mirror finish, and you can keep going. You can polish on cloth. So yes, I would imagine they did, but I would also imagine there was quite a hierarchy of types of buttons, because any society that values buttons perhaps disproportionately is going to have a sort of a social hierarchy of buttons, and buttons are going to indicate your position in society. So the Sackville Bagginses, for example, I would imagine would have the most expensive showy buttons, and maybe Bilbo and Frodo themselves, they're well to do, but they're not that showy, so they probably have a couple of ranks lower style of buttons. So there's an interesting thought experiment on the social hierarchy of buttons in Hobbiton.
Well, absolutely, yeah. I mean, and Bilbo was very proud of his buttons. He was quite distraught. He lost a few of them just when he was escaping from Gollum in The Hobbit, and he had to squeeze through a narrow crack, and some buttons came off, and he was happy he was alive, but he was very depressed about losing some buttons. And again, we were talking about, so this is the 1%. We do always have to remember. So Sam is very clearly kind of the working class, but the other three hobbits, Frodo, Merry, and Pippin, they're from established rich families in the Shire. But I'd love to move you over to sort of the other big fantasy world that I cover here, which is A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, coming out probably next year sometime, not entirely sure when yet, is A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, which is the next spin-off from Game of Thrones, based on the Dunk and Egg stories that George R. R. Martin has written. Fantastic stories if you've never read them, but the first one is based very much around a tourney. So we've got a new young knight who comes in and takes part in this tourney. He's not got much money to start with, so he kind of like scrapes together enough just to get some armor, and he's inherited a horse, that kind of thing. So could you just take us through quite a high level how would the tourney feel in a medieval world? What was the structure? What was the buzz like?
Well, depending on the time period, I mean, tournaments started very early. There were more war training, and they slowly transformed into events that had more structured rules. There were tournaments actually started as mock battles, by which I mean they were mock battles in that you weren't actually supposed to kill people, but you were going to be hitting them with real steel weapons. They were supposed to be rebaited, which that means slightly rounded edges, and you weren't supposed to stab people in the face, but people did die. But we know that because various religious authorities condemned people dying in tournament and said that was a waste. They should be off on crusade, killing other people instead, and giving their lives that way. So a few people, social commentators, condemned the tournament. So it was very violent. I would imagine you could compare it to a kind of modern day rugby or American football match, but without armor. There's as protective and the ability to actually beat people up. So people did capture other people and earn a lot of money from it. So it was a noble pursuit. And I also think that probably ordinary people, you had to have money and you had to have paperwork. Basically, you had to have heritage. Now, how you prove that or not, and whether you could pretend, is a sort of Knight's Tale movie. The Knight's Tale, it sort of pretends to be posh. And back in those days, there's no central form of government. Even heralds have paper books, and you could probably get away with pretending to be noble for quite a long time if you knew the right things. And there were poor nobility, as well as there were very, very rich nobility. There were also rich merchants who weren't noble. So there were very rich, ordinary people, if you like. So it's quite complicated. And the further you get through, when you get to the later medieval period, it gets very formalized, where you start to have the tilt rail to separate the horses down the middle of the joust, the joust with lances, and do a certain number of passes, a certain number of plays. There's lots of different words for it and lots of different rules. So you would have been surrounded by ordinary people. There'll be a lot more ordinary people coming along for the spectacle. They are hoping to watch posh rich people get badly injured and wanting the fights. I mean, sure, there's a whole bunch of peasants going along going, I hope Lord whatever his face is gets a right pasting because I don't like him. A little bit like people go to watch ice hockey, for example, and want the fights. So I think there's a sort of an aspect of that. I'm sure there were people who wanted their lord to win, and it would bring positive feedback. They get more money for the society, and he needs a new tower in his castle. So they were very social. So you'd have this lot of social hierarchy. And going in as a low-level noble, you would probably be treated quite abruptly by the higher nobles, because they're trying to put you down, but they're also going to be very nervous. So I've jousted at the Tower of London and Pendennis Castle and Kenilworth, for real, in the moats and the tilt yards of real castles, and I'm doing it for real. It's a real sport, they're real lances, and you can really get hurt. What you're trying to do is do as well as you can in that moment. I don't find I'm thinking about trying to win or not. I'm just trying to do the pass, work with the horse, lower the lance at the right time, break my lance. And if I do that, I stand a chance of prizes. If I miss, then I don't. And so it's very, very focused moment, especially when you close the visor and you're locked in place. You can hear your own breathing. It's wonderful. I haven't jousted for a couple of years now, but because of the whole pandemic. But I ought to go back to it at some stage because I do enjoy it.
Well, I mean, it sounds fascinating. I mean, I've witnessed jousting sort of in real life. I guess how realistic is it for people who have seen these kind of modern? I don't know whether reenactments is the right word here, but the reenactment of jousting. Is it? You said earlier that you've had people getting angry with you because they thought you were trying to hurt them or something like that.
No, they wanted to hurt me because I was beating them.
Is it what we see today? Is that the same as it was then?
There are two types. Three main types of modern jousting. So they're all very theatrical. They're all very about entertainment. So the colours, the pageantry, presenting yourself to the crowd, wanting to be a bit show-offy. Maybe I've got horses that I've trained to rear and do the fancy stuff. So I would ride into the ring, salute the king and queen or whoever it might be, and then try and in rear and then salute the crowd and try to capture the enthusiasm of the crowd, which again,
Play to the crowd,
exactly. You want to be the crowd's favourite, because if there's ever a draw, they sometimes do public proclamation who won, and if everyone thinks you're the best, then you get to win and you get the prize or whatever it might be. So it's always good to do. I don't mind losing, but I quite like winning as well. So there's broadly three sorts. There's a theatrical pretend jousting, if you like. It's still very dangerous. There's still very good horse people. It still can be difficult, but they know who's going to win and who's going to hit and who's going to fall off. That's like a stunt show. They do a lot of those. Some of those are done at places like Warwick Castle. They're great, really entertaining, but it's more pretend, if you like, in as much as you can pretend when you're dealing with horses and lances. But one person is going to lose and one person is going to win. There's an intermediate form of jousting which uses what are called frangible lances. These are lances made with balsa or a breakable tip. So one of the problems with jousting is it's very expensive. You break lances, and lances are quite expensive. They're made of wood, and if you can replace the tip, it's a bit cheaper. So the tip of a lance is typically these days about £10, but a full lance, to have a full lance made, you're to about £30 or £40 per lance. So if you're going somewhere and for example, I might break 9 lances in a tournament. That's 9 times the price of a lance. So it adds up, it kind of adds up in price, which of course it did back then as well. That's why you had to be rich. You're going to be damaging your armor. You need a horse, or sometimes the horses are having a bad day. You might need a replacement horse. You need staff, and you're going to break lances. And then there's the fully historic stuff, which I started 10, 12 years ago now. Me and a friend, a Frenchman called Philippe Willaume, and I did real jousting, by which I mean a solid wooden lance with a metal tip, really hitting each other at high speed with proper armor on, made of steel. And there is nothing pretend about that. That is jousting as it was done back in the day. There's nothing. There's no. You can't pull a lance blow. One of the things to look for in a joust, if you're not sure which sort it is, and they're all great, don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing anybody for doing theatrical. The solid, what we call solid lance jousting, is very dangerous. But all of them, basically the breakable tips and the solid lance jousts, people had died doing it in the modern period, and been taken to hospital frequently. So I've unseated 3 people in tournaments in a few years. I've never been unseated myself, but I got close to it a couple of times. But if you couch, so it's hard to show. Basically, couching a lance, if you want to maximize the impact, you need to squeeze it with your elbow into the side of your cuirass, and you're holding it there, and you hit with your whole body. If you see people jousting like you do, I can't really show it, like you see with the elbow up in the air. If you look at Knight's Tale, the fantastic modern movie, you'll see all of the stuntmen have got their elbows held like this. That reduces the impact on the other person dramatically, because all you've got is the impact of the lance. So the lance being held in your hand, the lance will just go through your hand. Whereas if it's clamped like that under your here, it's going to do a lot more damage. So if you're trying to break a lance, really, and it's not a stunt lance like they have in movies, you're going to have to clamp it down, and it's going to be a big impact. It's like being tackled in rugby. Even if you hit, it's like a massive buffet, and sometimes the lance goes across your throat here, so you need throat protection. When you've got pretend lance jousting, you hold it like this, and the lance will slide through if there's any impact, so it's much safer. It gets a bit technical, but have a look. So
how, I was going to say how easy is it? It's probably the wrong way of phrasing it again, but a lot of the time in movies, and I would second your love of A Knight's Tale, I think it's a fantastic film, but in a lot of these kind of things, you see like the bad guy there, and we go, oh, he's aiming for the eye slot or something. I mean, to me from the outside, I don't ride horses, but it looks like you're going at a scary fast speed. You've got a whopping great big long weapon. That seems like an incredibly complicated and tough thing to do, to aim for like just a particular small slot here or under the arm or whatever it is. Is it just that you are just trying to hit, like I just want to smash my lance, or is it possible to actually do that kind of precision, I'm an evil knight going to kill this person, and make it look like an accident?
Yes, it's fully possible. I asked myself that question because I'd never really tried with a sharp lance to get it through the eye slot of the helmet, and I've tried, and I can do it. So yes, you can.
You can.
When you're jousting, you're trying to hit parts of the body. So historically, we think that breaking your lance on the helmet was the biggest score, then on the targe, on the shield, and then on the body or the arms. Anything below the waist doesn't count. Anywhere near the horse doesn't count. That would be a foul, or missing would be foul. You don't get any. And if you don't break your lance, if it skids off, it's called an attaint.
Yeah.
You've hit, but it's bounced off, so you haven't kind of put enough energy into it, or the edge or the tip of the lance has skidded off. But yes, in war, or if you're being an absolute so-and-so, I think you can aim your lance at the eye slot. Now, if you're doing a lance apiece with a sort of splayed end, a coronel, specifically designed not to go through the eye slot, specifically designed, even if one prong goes into the ocularum, it'll end up next to your eye, which I've had, and you think that's not very nice. And it'll clunk onto the helmet. The helmet will absorb the impact, slightly dent maybe, or whatever it does, and then the lance will break and it'll fly off. With a sharp point, you're aiming for the target. So I did a video quite a few years ago now where I was aiming at the eye slot of a footman's helmet with a sharp lance, and I practice a lot. So I practice with a quintain which has a 4-inch square on it. So people know, so it's 12 foot. So what is that in meters? About a 3 meter long, between 3 and 4, sort of 3 and 4 meter long piece of lance, traveling at 20 to 30 miles an hour in a straight line against the target. I practice on my quintain at home with a 4-inch piece of wood, so it's literally 4 inches square, and I can hit that in practice. If I'm not stressed out, I could probably hit that 9 times out of 10. But the eye slot's narrower, so the eye slot on the helmet I tried was about probably half-inch wide, so maybe it's like a centimeter, just over a centimeter wide. And I thought I'd probably only get that in 1 in 100. I hit it on my 4th attempt. So I hit around the eye slot every single time, and I got the lance into the eye slot on my 4th attempt. So I reckon, and then I missed a few times afterwards. So I reckon probably 1 in 10 you could get the lance into the eye slot with a sharp point if you were practiced. And let's assume the baddie is going to have practiced this. You'd be practicing it every day, and you would get better and better, like you do with everything. So I think it's very, very possible to do that.
Okay. So it's definitely possible, but it does require skill. It does require practice, and it is the kind of thing that you could theoretically say, "Oh, it was just an accident," and people would
absolutely, and that's true as well, because it has been an accident before. We've had lances go into people's eye slots because they slide up the shield sometimes. So you hit somebody on the shield, and it'll slide up into the face, and the physics takes over. You can't. If you're going past somebody and there's a twisting movement, your lance is, it's 9 foot, 12 foot long. Can't do anything about it. It's going to hit what it's going to hit. So I have dented people's helmets almost to their face before now, because my lance just slid up, smashed into their helmet. Their helmet wasn't as strong as they thought, and it dented the helmet in quite a lot. So, and I've had people with bits of balsa stuck in the eye slot before in tournament. Accidents can and do happen, very sadly.
Absolutely. Okay. Can I talk or pick up on something you sort of mentioned in passing, which is the entourage of a knight? Because we don't often think about this. You get the knight, but the knight will, if they're going to a tourney, they might have a few different horses. They've got, from what you've said, several dozen lances that they need to be carting around. They'll need to be fed, armor looked after, and all the rest of it. So I imagine for going to a tourney, the entourage of a knight would be quite significant. I want to put to you a scenario. This is something that I've thought about a little while. It's sort of the nerd in the deep weeds of A Song of Ice and Fire. There's a scenario where the prince of the realm, this is Prince Rhaegar for people on this channel who are deep in the weeds with me, he goes off with, we're told, a handful of his closest friends, of whom at least 2 are knights. They go and pick up a woman, Lyanna, the circumstances of that are one of the big mysteries of the story, and they end up at this tower. It's known as the Tower of Joy. It's a watchtower overlooking quite a broad mountain pass, and they stay there for months, as far as we can tell, several months. During this time, the woman Lyanna has a baby. Now, the way that this is always kind of portrayed is you get who's left there. Well, we get Prince Rhaegar. There are 3 members of his Kingsguard, and then there's Lyanna, and that's it. Realistically, I've always thought that can't be it. Okay, fair enough, they're going on a secret mission. They might have started out just them. But if you're going to be staying in a watchtower in the middle of a mountain pass, and there's going to be a baby born, realistically, to a member of the royal family, realistically, what sort of extra entourage might there be? Just in terms of logistics, food, giving birth to a baby, looking after the horses, that kind of thing.
Well, a medieval knight was expected to bring fighting men with him, as well as the baggage train, as well as the other things. So a medieval knight would have, bare minimum would be 1 or 2 men-at-arms, so sort of foot soldiers who know what they're doing, 1 or 2 archers, bare minimum. So you're talking about fighting men with 1 knight. You're talking about 5 of them. Bare minimum. Many had many dozens of and each one of them, you probably have a squire, and you probably have a groom for your 1 horse. So a groom can probably look after 4 horses, but realistically, going to have a groom, a sub-groom. You're probably going to have a small group of people looking after your horses. So let's say you're going to have 3 people looking after your horses as well. Your squire can look after your armor for you, sharpen your swords. You'll need a manservant, at least. You'll need cooks. You'll need sort of skivvies to help the cook as well. So you're going to have the kitchen facilities to cook your food and prepare it. Again, probably at least 3. You're probably going to have a washerwoman as well, at least 1, if not more. And then you're going to have all of the sort of dog's body type sort of junior members of staff that are going to be running errands and doing things. So my guess would be, and that would be for a minor noble, you're talking about a dozen to 15 people roughly for a minor knight as part of his the people coming along. Plus you need people bringing you food, so you've got food for all of those people as well. You're on a watchtower. Where do you get? Presumably there's a well, presumably there's food stored there. How well are you going to eat? Where's the kitchen? How are you going to keep warm? There's a whole infrastructure around it. Think of a knight as a little bit like a Formula One driver, a racing car driver. The knight gets all the glamour, the driver gets all the glamour, but there's all the technicians, the engineers, there's the sort of team boss who tells people what to do. You've got your backroom computer specialists and your engineer. You've got, I don't know how many people in the Formula One team, but I imagine it's dozens. It's almost certainly the same for a knight. And the higher up in rank you've got, you'd have a chamberlain. You'd have people who do your admin for you if you're nobility. You're going to have a scrivener. Somebody's going to be writing things out. You might be literate as a member of the nobility, and arguably most peasants had some knowledge of reading and writing, a little, but not much. But if you're going to need to do posh documents, you're going to have somebody write it out for you. So you need a scribe. And you'll need somebody to keep your books as well. You'll need an accountant. So that there's the household infrastructure for a noble household was largely run by the women, actually, and the women had the keys to the spice box, for example, which was very valuable. And so we tend to focus on the people at the top of the pyramid, but there are going to be a whole bunch of people lower down. And the lower down the pyramid you get, the wider it gets as well. So people are going to have children, so there's going to be, the washerwoman probably has a family of her own. She probably has the man with her. You need carpenters, huntsmen who are going out catching rabbits and things. So it expands. You have what's called a household. So, a knight going off on his own is all very well if you're sort of an errant knight and, some kind of Arthurian quest. But realistically, you'll need people.
So I think from my perspective, what I'm hearing there, I'm just trying to tie this into the A Song of Ice and Fire scenario we've got. Even if we accept that the prince and the knights headed off on their own on their errant quest, once they actually set up base somewhere and thought, well, we're going to be here for weeks, months, whatever, that's when there has to be an infrastructure, because they wouldn't know where to get the fuel from. If they wanted to write something, they would have to have somebody to come in and do the writing, probably. There would be errand people, there'd be washer people, obviously somebody to help with the birth as well, because knights probably weren't trained in giving birth. So that kind of thing. So I think my takeaway is that, having talked to you at the Tower of Joy, there wasn't just those people. There were definitely others. Those might be the only fighting people, but there are almost certainly other people. Okay. I did want, however, we've got a few more minutes, but I would love to talk about your book as well. You've got a book coming
Thank you.
out, Lord of Blackthorn, which is this is the start of, I think, is a trilogy, and you're obviously bringing a lot of your knowledge and experience into this, but it's got a fantasy element as well. Why don't you give us the sort of the pitch? What is this book about?
So a young knight, he gets himself caught up in a situation. The king besieges the castle of an errant baron, and the king gets very upset about things and says, first man over the walls will win the castle. Anyway, by circumstance, our hero knight, who doesn't have a name at the beginning because he's nobody cares about him, he's very, very minor, happens to be first over, and he manages to win the castle. Anyway, the king says, I didn't mean this castle, I meant one over there. That's in the borderlands. That's really dangerous. And yeah, so our knight starts out being very naive and not really knowing about, he's quite young and he's naive and he doesn't really, and he's got these rules of chivalry in his head. It's a late medieval setting, but it's not our late medieval setting. The peasants believe in ghosts and goblins and bogles in the woods and things like that. There are outlaws in the woods, but they're not quite what you think they might be. And there are tales of dragons, but they're always secondhand. And there are deep woods. So he gets sent out to this borderland to look after his new fiefdom. And he turns up, and all is not what he expected. And he has to start a new life, basically, and build up from more or less the very beginning. And it was going to be a one-off, but there's so many parts of it. It's quite a big book. It's 144,000 words. So my publisher, which is Rebellion, is my company as well, but it's quite big. They said it's going to be a big fat book, and I said, yeah, that's fine. I've written the words, so I think they're good. So it's a complete story, but there are lots of other areas of this borderland that I want to explore. So it's right on the edge of the place they called the Kingdom, and there's a trade road that goes through this location, which is why it's valuable. But the trade has been totally disrupted by the former owner, and so the story is all about what our hero does to sort of rebuild things and how he learns about himself and he learns about people. And it actually covers quite a few of the areas we've touched upon in terms of entourage. And Knight on his own isn't very useful, but needs people. How does he get people? How does he convince people who haven't really bothered with the whole noble thing? How does he convince them to help him? How does he bring everybody together? What's going on in the woods? Why are the weird things happening? Why is he having repeated dreams of dragons? His grandfather tells him stories about slaying a dragon. His grandfather claims to have slain a dragon, and he told him these stories when he was a boy. But he's a boy, and he's thought it's called my granddad making stories up, which is brilliant, but it's not true. Turns out it might have been true actually, but his granddad passed away when he was young before he went to become a knight. So he's now racking his brains trying to remember all the things his granddad told him, which he thought weren't true, but actually might be now. So it's kind of a bit of a boy's own adventure tale. There's lots of fighting in it, and there's lots of travel. There's lots of building landscapes and dealing with people. But it's not. I would call it medieval, sort of low medieval fantasy. There is magic, or at least we, the reader, are led to believe there's magic, but our main character's not quite sure in the story. But other people are completely sure there's magic. So there you go. There. I don't give too much away, but it is fun.
No. It's fantastic. As I say, I mean, it sounds actually as though when you read a Game of Thrones book one, Song of Ice and Fire, a lot of that is very low fantasy as well. You get the ice zombies appearing at the beginning and dragons at the end, a bit of a magic-y dream sequence, but as a whole, the wise characters, as we're told to think of them, mock the very idea of magic, but clearly it is there. So I love all of that. When is this out? When
if we're doing a Kickstarter,
where would they get it?
Yeah, we launched Kickstarter on the 16th of November. So the Kickstarter is chugging along for special editions of the book. The book will be those sort of hardback and signed editions, and we got funded in 23 minutes, which is rather good, rather nice. And then the book will be published next year, sort of towards the middle or end of next year, I think, in the normal course of things. The book publishing trade is quite slow. If anybody knows about it, you've got to sort of sell books into bookshops. And they're buying now for things they're selling in the summer next year. So there's a bit of a process there, but the hardback books are available via the Kickstarter. We should be able to deliver those fairly soon. The book's written, it's been edited. I had being the boss of a company is always slightly awkward in that people are sometimes not necessarily honest to you. They kind of look at what you've done and go, yeah, it's all right. But deep down they're not that impressed. Anyway, my publishers and my editors, all of them said, actually, it's a really good book. And I was quite flattered because I was sort of expecting them to go, yeah, it's all right, because you know what it's like when you write. You do your best, but you're never quite sure, and you wait for other people to judge it. And I've been quite flattered that people have said they think it's a really good book. So. But I will leave that for the viewer to judge for themselves.
Excellent. Well, if it's not out until next year, you've got time to write another one in the meantime as well. That sounds fantastic.
I've been challenged. I'm trying to write a trilogy now. So the first one was great. The first one's got a beginning, middle, and end, and it's its own standalone book. But there are lots of little areas that I wanted to explore more, which I couldn't fit into that book. And so we're gonna have more adventures for sure.
Excellent. Well, I'm delighted to hear it. And I mean, I know we're coming to the end of our time. One 30 seconds answer on this one, because it's just something which I'd be intrigued by. Do you have pet peeve about how the medieval world is generally presented on film? So, for example, for me, I'm always very annoyed when heroes go into some underground place and they've got their flaming torch and they hold it right in front of them like this. And I just think you can't see a thing. Like, they might be great for lighting, but you can't see a thing. You hold it somewhere over there.
You literally can't. You've got to hold it. You've got to hold it right out here.
Yeah. Do you have a similar pet peeve that always gets you?
Yes, armor. Armor is supposed to protect you against things like sword slashes and stabs. Because if it didn't, it's heavy and awkward, and you don't really, it's not heavy and awkward, but it's heavier and more awkward to wear than ordinary clothing. So if armor doesn't protect you from that slash across the midriff by the hero, then you should probably get rid of it. I have tested this out. I had a big bloke hit me really hard with a sharp sword while I'm wearing a cuirass and face protection, because I was worried about the sword might fling up into my face and do some real damage. Hands behind my back, hit me as hard as you can, doesn't even scratch the armor. Even if you've got magic and dragons and things like that, armor still needs to protect you, otherwise you don't wear it. So plate armor protects you from stabs by any normal mortal unless they've got a magic sword, and that's fine. If it's a magic sword, it can cut through unmagical armor. But presumably if you get magic swords, you also get magic armor. And you know what? If rich people who don't want to die are going into battle, they're going to have the most expensive and the best form of protective equipment that money can buy or science of the time can come up with. So they're going to have protective equipment. So medieval armor was very, very protective, but it reduces your vision. You can die of heat exhaustion. It makes you slower than if you're not wearing it. So the pet peeve of mine is the heavily armored monsters come towards you and they're in thick plate. You're thinking, holy moly, that looks bulletproof. And then the hero steps aside and slashes them across the belly and they fall down. And you go, Number one, if you're slashed across the belly, you don't die straight away anyway. It might kill you eventually, but you're not going to just die. Now, number two, you can't cut through armor like that. Can't even stab through it. So,
well, there you have it. Armor is good. Is the breaking news for today? As I say, it's no, I agree. It does often. Even I look at it and go, it really. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on, Jason. It's been an absolute pleasure and delight. Do you just want to sign off by letting people know if they want more of the Modern Knight, where they can find you?
Yep. So Modern History TV on YouTube. I do a podcast called Future Imperfect as well, where I chat about mostly medieval things, but sometimes other things like the environment and science and basically subjects that interest me with people that are happy to have a good old natter with me. That's also available on Modern History Podcasts, which is another YouTube channel I've just started. So because I wanted people to be able to listen to both, but podcasts don't sit on an ordinary YouTube channel very well. And that's about it, really. I mean, my big company is Rebellion, if you're interested in computer games, but my personal passions are the medieval and medieval fantasy. So be delighted I try to answer comments as best I can. So feel free to reach out to me if you want.
Excellent. Well, this has been instructive and delightful. So thank you so much for coming on. Maybe when I've got another bunch of questions, I'll have you on again some other time. But
I'd love to do that because we can have a good chat. So absolutely be delighted.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much. We will be back with another one of these on this channel next week. So take care, everyone, and I will see you again soon.